University's School of Foreign Affairs. I would also like to welcome and introduce Ms. Moitri Sengupta as the guest interviewer for the event today. She is a research scholar at the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University. She has taught political science to undergraduate students at Victoria College, and she is also an MPhil research fellow at the Roichi Sasakawa Young Leaders Fellowship Program of the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research and the Nippon Foundation, Japan, from 2018 to 2019. She assisted on a research project on environmental migration as part of a national research scheme from 2019 to 2020. Her interests include international relations theory, environmental policy, and the environmental climate change human mobility nexus. I would now like to hand over to Ms. Sengupta to continue with the event.
Um, am I audible? Okay. Thank you very much, Raisina House, and a very good morning, or a very good afternoon, or a very good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Moitri, and we are very pleased to have with us today Dr. Elizabeth Ferris to discuss the theme for today, which is protecting the rights of internally displaced persons in the context of climate change. And this is part of a continuing series which Raisina House has been working with this month. It is on human rights and humanitarian action. And before I request Dr. Elizabeth Ferris to make her presentation, I will introduce the topic and then speak up. Okay. So internal displacement linked to the adverse effects of climate change is expected to increase significantly over the coming years and decades. Recent projections indicate that without concrete climate and development action, over 143 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America alone could be forced to move within their own countries by 2050, owing to the slow onset impacts of climate change. Most population movements relating to the adverse effects of environmental hazards and climate change are expected to remain within national borders. While this figure covers different types of human mobility, it gives an indication of the expected scale of movement in these three regions, which suggests that the global scale will be even higher. So climate change will affect every region, although some countries and communities are more vulnerable, including small island developing states and least developed countries. The adverse effects of climate change can involve sudden and slow onset events. Sudden onset events can be linked to extreme weather-related hazards, including tropical cyclones, typhoons, hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, hydrological hazards, including coastal floods, mud flows, or geophysical hazards, including earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, etc. Slow onset events, on the other hand, can be described as events that evolve gradually from incremental changes occurring over many years or from an increased frequency or intensity of recurring climate events. Slow onset events include sea level rise, increasing temperatures, ocean acidification, glacial retreat, and related impacts, salinization, land and forest degradation, etc. Slow onset and sudden onset events, such as floods or storms, can also be intertwined, requiring holistic approaches that take their interrelations into account. There is extensive evidence of the widespread impacts of climate change on the enjoyment of human rights, such as rights to life, health, housing, food, water, and education, cultural rights and collective rights, such as rights of indigenous peoples and the right to self-determination. Those impacts contribute to displacement, and displacement further impacts the enjoyment of human rights. Under the 1998 Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which reflect international human rights law and international humanitarian law, Arbitrary displacement is prohibited, including in cases of disasters, unless the safety and health of those affected requires their evacuation. Human mobility in the context of climate change can take many forms, including displacement, migration, and planned relocation. In most cases, movement is not entirely voluntary or forced, but rather falls somewhere on a continuum between the two, with different degrees of voluntariness and constraint. In fact, environmental migration can be forced and voluntary, temporary and permanent, domestic and international, without forgetting the flip side, namely the forced immobility of many populations trapped by the impacts of environmental changes. The issue of migration and international displacement in the context of climate change therefore lies in the intersection of various legal and policy fields, including human rights law, environmental law, disaster relief law, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development. In this context, we are particularly keen to listen to Dr. Beth Ferris speak today about how law and policy engages with issues of internal displacement in the context of climate change. Dr. Beth Ferris is a research professor with the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and an adjunct professor in Georgetown Law School. From January to September 2016, she served as senior advisor to the UN General Assembly's Summit for Refugees and Migrants in New York. From 2006 to 2015, she was a senior fellow and co-director of the Brookings LSE project on internal displacement, where she worked to support understanding and protection of internally displaced persons. Prior to joining Brookings, she spent 20 years working in the field of humanitarian assistance, most recently in Geneva, Switzerland, at the World Council of Churches. She also served as the director of the Church World Service's Immigration and Refugee Program as research director for the Life and Peace Institute in Uppsala, Sweden, and as a Fulbright professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Mexico. Her teaching experience has included positions at Lafayette College, Miami University, and Pembroke State University. She has written and worked extensively on refugee, migration, and humanitarian issues. Dr. Beth Ferris, welcome, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Sengupta. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning or this evening for those of you in India, and I commend you for bringing up this issue. I think it is going to be one of the defining issues of our time, the way in which the world deals with people who are moving because of the effects of climate change, which, as you mentioned, take many different forms, and there's a whole lot we just don't know. But what I'm going to do is give you a short presentation, a little bit on internally displaced people, IDPs generally, and then move into what we know or don't know about migration stemming from climate change. So I'm going to share my screen. This works. So, and this is a photo actually from Bangladesh, showing the effects of riverine erosion, which is, physically destroying the territory of many people in South Asia and elsewhere. And as sea level rise increases, this is likely to increase. But first, to start with IDPs, internally displaced persons, the accepted definition is actually quite broad, particularly in comparison with the definition of refugees, which is much more narrow. And all refugee movements always involve cross-border movement. And according to the 1951 convention, it's really on the basis of persecution on one of 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, and political opinion. In contrast, the definition of IDPs is people who are forced to flee, or obliged to flee, or leave their homes, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, generalized violence, human rights violations, natural or human-made disasters, and haven't crossed an internationally recognized state border. So it's a much broader definition. It clearly specifies those who are displaced because of disasters should be considered as IDPs. This definition comes from the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, which, as we just heard, was created about 25 years ago by advocates as a way of providing some guidance to governments and others about who is responsible for IDPs, what are their basic rights, and so on. This is considered to be soft law. This is not a convention that's ratified by governments or signed, but right now about 40 governments in the world have incorporated at least some of the guiding principles into their national laws and policies. They've been translated into lots of different languages. They're widely available. They've been used by advocates, by human rights activists, as well as by governments and NGOs and international organizations. In contrast to the guiding principles, the African Union has come up with a binding international convention on IDPs, known as the Kampala Convention, which was adopted in 2006. Quite a few states have signed it. It's been much slower in terms of incorporating the provisions of the convention into domestic legislation. And the Kampala Convention stresses the obligations of states. States are responsible to prevent displacement. It explicitly names climate change as a driver of internal displacement. One of the first international treaties to explicitly recognize the responsibilities of states toward those who are displaced by climate change. Those of you who are looking for some kind of legal norms to develop programs or approaches to people displaced by climate change might want to take a look at the Kampala Convention, formerly known as the African Union Convention on the Prevention and Response to Internal Displacement in Africa. Right now, there are about twice as many people in the world who are displaced internally by conflict as refugees. IDPs tend to get much less attention than refugees, primarily because they occur within the borders of a country. They aren't considered to be an international issue of concern until they cross the border. So in Syria, there are 8 million internally displaced people, maybe another 6 or 7 million refugees in neighboring countries, but the refugees get a lot more attention, money, energy than those who are displaced internally. And the growth of IDPs has been much faster than the growth of numbers of refugees in the world, or even stateless or asylum seekers. The big question with internal displacement that really affects both conflict and disasters is the question of who is responsible for them. Unlike refugees, where the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has a mandate to protect and assist this particular group, there's no international agency that has a mandate to deal with IDPs. Rather, IDPs are the responsibility of national governments. It's national authorities that have the responsibility to protect them, to provide assistance, to seek durable solutions for them. And you see the problem, and particularly in conflict situations, when the government itself is responsible for some of the displacement, for example, in places like Myanmar or Syria or Yemen or a dozen other countries. It's that same government that then is responsible for making sure that people are safe and cared for. On the international level, there's a cluster system that's supposed to determine which agency is best placed to deal with IDPs on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it works quite well, and sometimes it doesn't. And then moving into climate change, we know that climate change is displacing people already in many different parts of the world. The photo on the left, which is a little bit dark, is from California in the United States in 2018, where thousands and thousands of people were displaced by wildfires. This is a picture of folks camping out in a Walmart parking lot where many of the displaced were sheltering until shelters could be arranged. The photo on the right is from Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2016, where many millions of people were displaced, some of whom were displaced permanently and were unable to ever return to their homes. And that's one of the things that makes people displaced by climate change and environmental factors different from those displaced by conflict, where at least theoretically there's a possibility that conflicts will be resolved and people can perhaps at some point in the future go back home. With some cases of people displaced by disasters and climate change, their original homes, their community, their habitats become uninhabitable. A mudslide destroys a village, or as we saw in that first photo, coastal erosion, takes away the very land where people were settled. I'm sure you all know just some of the basics about what's happening to our world because of climate change, but this is just a graph showing the increase in temperature since 1880, which is when most projections are calculated. That's considered the beginning of the industrial age, but particularly since 1980, you see a consistent and increasing rise in world temperature. These are from the month of January, but you'd see similar things from other months. We know, and as was mentioned in the introduction, one of the consequences of climate change are changes in the frequency, intensity, spatial extent, duration, and timing of weather and climate extremes. It can result in, a whole range of different kinds of disasters. This is a photo of wildfires. I think one of the clearest relationships are with increasing temperature, the rise in heat waves. You see that in South Asia, you see it in North America, you see it in Europe, whereas the temperature increases, sometimes having deadly consequences. I remind you that in 2003, a heat wave in Europe killed between 70 and 80,000 people, mostly elderly people who were trapped or unable to seek protection or cooler air in their apartments. So disasters take a lot of different forms, from hurricanes, typhoons, this photo taken from the space shuttle to drought. And typically we look at natural hazards in terms of slow and rapid onset. Slow onset, the big one being drought, which may develop over a period of years, but also sea level rise, erosion, salination of water. All of those occur over time, and all of them are directly related to increasing global temperatures. On the rapid or sudden onset side, we have those that are related to weather, such as cyclones, typhoons, hurricanes, storm surge, flash flooding, which are generally considered to be related to the climate change. Earthquakes, volcanoes, not considered to be associated with climate change. Those geological manifestations of hazards are, sometimes have the same effect of displacing people, but can't, or at least not right now, be directly attributed to climate change. There are some guidelines for dealing with protection of people who are displaced or otherwise affected by disasters. The basic thing is you do not lose your human rights when a disaster occurs. You're entitled to the same rights, to not be discriminated against for the same kinds of reasons as those who are not displaced. And these were developed really in the aftermath of the South Asian tsunami in 2004 to provide some guidance to governments and international and national organizations working in disaster relief to remember that, providing assistance after a disaster isn't just about providing logistical support of water and food and medical care and rebuilding houses, but there is a very clear human rights dimension to the way in which people are assisted and protected after disasters. From the very beginning of our awareness of climate change, and usually dated to the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, back in 1990, in their very first report, there was an affirmation that the gravest effects of climate change may be on human migration, as millions are displaced by shoreline erosion, coastal erosion, and severe drought. So from the very beginning, it was recognized that one of the main impacts of climate change was going to be the movement of people. But it took a long time for the UN's climate change machinery, which really works through these regular meetings called Conference of Parties or COP meetings. It wasn't until about 2010 that there was a realization that, migration could be a form of adaptation to climate change. I think our understanding of the relationship between environmental change and migration took a quantitative and qualitative leap forward about 10 years ago with the publication of the UK's Foresight Report. This was a mammoth academic endeavor with, scientists from atmospheric scientists and geologists together with economists and anthropologists and social scientists trying to look at how migration would be shaped. And a lot of what we know still comes from the Foresight Report. There have been many other studies, but they've kind of amplified rather than contradicted some of these early findings. The report found that clearly environmental change is going to increase migration, but that environmental change always interacts with other factors, that rich people and poor people and people of different races and ethnic minorities will be affected in different ways, that it's really hard to separate out just environmental change as the single driver of migration. This multi-causal nature of environmental migration causes real difficulties for those looking at the policy and legal sphere where, under our current international system of migration and displacement, we draw a fundamental distinction between those who move voluntarily, considered to be migrants, those who are forced, considered to be refugees or IDPs. And as was noted in the introduction, the reality is there is a lot of gray areas in there. Surprisingly, the report found, and this has been substantiated, that people are likely to migrate from areas of environmental risk to areas where there are even more environmental risk. Sometimes the case of Dhaka is used, where people migrating from coastal areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise and other forms of climate change that drive displacement, but they move to Dhaka where they live in very marginal situations and sometimes even more vulnerable than they were before they moved. And as the introduction noted, that our attention is drawn not to just those who move, but those who are unable to move, sometimes called a trapped or involuntarily immobile populations, those who don't have the resources to move. We know from research in the field of migration that it's rarely the poorest of the poor who move. They don't have the money even for a bus ticket or to make the journey. And that, particularly in the case when you look at environmental pressures for movement, you'll see some people who are unable for various reasons to move, who may be the most vulnerable and most in need of assistance. So they conclude that the decision to stay or go is complex. Different people make the decision in different ways. On the one hand, there are environmental, social, political, economic pressures, but there are also individual characteristics, age, gender, health, education, family, or resources. Also individual tolerance for risk. Just a personal aside, I have two sisters who live in South Texas in the United States. This year was a very bad year for hurricanes, and both of them were displaced 2 or 3 times. You had to pack up and move inland for a few days and come back. In one case, there was a lot of damage done to the house, and the other not so much. But one of my sisters said, "I've had it, I'm moving," made plans to move into the interior of Texas. The other sister said, "No, I'm going to stay here. It's not that bad. I really don't have any place to go." But you see that even the same family, same about age, same kinds of environmental conditions, 2 individuals making different decisions. And parenthetically, I'll say that one of the really interesting things in looking at climate change-induced displacement and migration is the fact that it affects rich countries and poor countries, and that a lot of developing countries have developed much better responses and much better policies than some of the rich developed countries. There's a lot to learn from places like Vanuatu and Fiji, for example. So in terms of mobility as an adaptation, the UNFCCC decided in 2010 to characterize it in terms of migration, displacement, planned relocation. Migration usually voluntary, often anticipatory. It's people who see the handwriting on the wall and move while they can. Tends to be, I think, people with more resources, and not just economic resources, but, the freedom to move. A lot of older people or people with disabilities or people with family responsibilities may, want to migrate, but being able to do so for family reasons. This occurs mostly internally within the borders of a country. So we're seeing people moving right now because of the effects of climate change. They're often kind of moving as part of a general rural to urban migration pattern or other economic migration. It's hard to single people out that they're moving just because of climate change. Kiribati had a very interesting program to encourage its population to acquire skills that would enable them to move easily to other countries. For example, training nurses or cruise line stewards, so they would always be able to have a job. And the question, with migration, people with means will move, are moving. But the question, who is left behind? Second category of displacement, forced usually after disaster or loss of livelihoods, mostly within country. The figures that you cited in the introduction from the World Bank, says most of this movement figures are 90 to 95% are going to be internally displaced. People who do cross an international border because of disasters are not under international law considered to be refugees. They're explicitly excluded from the convention. And I think there's very little likelihood that the world would adopt a new convention on climate change, cross-border displacement, though some people hope. You see that the numbers of people displaced by disasters every year is quite variable. It averages out to be about 25 million people a year. But some years, particularly 2010, which as you recall was the year of the Haitian earthquake, as well as these massive Pakistani floods and other disasters, was a particularly bad year. We don't know the extent to which climate change affects normal climatic cycles. There've always been hurricanes that have displaced people and tornadoes and droughts. That's part of our human history. The extent to which, you can see the patterns of all of this increasing because of climate change, but we still can't say Hurricane Harvey or Typhoon Haiyan were caused by climate change. You can't really pin that on, one specific disaster on climate change, though the patterns are there. We don't know how many people are going to move. The estimates are all over the place, from 50 million to 1 billion people in the same time period. We don't know the extent to which mitigation and adaptation efforts will allow people to remain in their countries or their communities. We also don't really understand how climate change acts as a force multiplier of conflict. A lot of speculation that climate change is driving conflict over resources, but the empirical evidence isn't yet so clear. And finally, I'll just draw attention to an initiative started almost 8 or 9 years ago, the Nansen Initiative, now known as the Platform for Disaster Displacement. It was set up to look at the particular situation of people who cross international borders because of the effects of climate change or other forms of environmental change. One of the difficulties in looking at climate change displacement is, do you exclude those who are displaced by tsunamis or earthquakes or volcanoes? Even though they're forced to flee because of disasters, does the world have less of a responsibility to them because the natural hazard isn't linked so much to climate change? So the Platform for Disaster Displacement looks at all disasters, including those that aren't caused by climate change. And in their research and work, they found that over 50 governments already make some provision for disaster displacement, people who come to their countries without, because of environmental reasons, who don't fall into the category of refugees. But so this is a very quick overview of, it stops here. Sorry, I'm trying to get out of here. So this has got kind of a quick overview of some of the issues around internal displacement. But I really look forward to our conversation, to talking about issues of particular concern to you. And I'm happy to address any of these in more detail. So over to you, Sengupta.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. That was very comprehensive and very insightful for all of us. And before we begin our first round of discussion, I would like to direct our audience to the chat box, where you can contribute questions or comments which you may have for Dr. Ferris. And yes, I already see some, so more are welcome. Dr. Ferris, taking cue from a few things that few slides and a few things that you mentioned, I pick a few things up. First, that there is obviously a problem of attributing causality when it comes to climate change induced displacement and migration. So how does international policy, regional policy, sub-regional policy, you did mention Kampala Convention, but others, how does the global policy making, how do global policy making mechanisms engage with the fact that you cannot really attribute causality to climate change? So how have policymakers so far dealt with that?
I think they've dealt with it very poorly because nobody really understands this relationship. There's a real reluctance by governments, particularly governments that are responsible for carbon emissions that are driving climate change. There's a real reluctance for those governments in particular to talk about having an obligation to receive people displaced by climate change. I know my government, the US government, administrations aside, has been reluctant to, say, because we're causing so much of the world's climate change, therefore we should be expected to allow people to enter our country. So there's been a real reluctance to take on that obligation. Some people have talked about expanding the current refugee definition, and there's real resistance to doing that among refugee advocates, a fear that if you reopen the Refugee Convention, governments would make it much more restrictive. So governments really don't know how to deal with this. The Nansen Initiative is really encouraging governments to develop their own particular policy responses and not try for some kind of a convention. But what's really missing in a lot of the discussion is the emphasis on the internal displacement. Yeah, there's a clear legal gap for those who cross the border. But, the reality is there are going to be millions, tens of millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people moving internally because of climate change. That calls for action at the municipal level. Our government's planning for it. Our government's planning to help people remain where they are. Is it planning to help people move or to help communities that receive these individuals? I think urban planners worldwide should be thinking about, in 10 years, what happens if our urban population increases by a third, whether it's Manaus, Brazil, or Norfolk, Virginia in the United States, or Chennai in India. There are lots of possibilities for large-scale migration, and there's been, I think, too much attention focused on the international movement or potential, and not enough on the reality that people are already moving because of climate change.
Absolutely, of course. I think what you mentioned is absolutely absolutely insightful, because you see, even when we focus more on cross-border displacement in the context of climate change, we of course don't have all the answers. But when we move on to internal displacement owing to climate change, I think the situation is much worse, because you're looking at very large data sets. You're looking at a lot of disaggregated data. How do you map? How do you chart human mobility? How do you chart decision-making frameworks? So how do policymakers deal with, for example, you mentioned the Kampala Convention. So how do how do policymakers deal with the fact that you cannot, you cannot really chart human mobility? So what do you essentially do?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing to a really important point, and that is that policymakers need to understand the situation and have good data in order to develop effective policy responses. And most of them don't have good data. There aren't good data. There are a few efforts. UN University did very interesting survey research among people in the Pacific Islands, areas that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But even there, when they interviewed people, are you thinking about moving? If so, why? I mean, the main drivers were still economic. I'm thinking about moving to get a job. And yeah, environment may be a factor, but it wasn't yet the driving reason. And so I think that, good policies on economic migration are likely to help those who are moving for environmental reasons as well. But governments also have some problems doing good problems with migration generally. So yeah, I think the lack of data, is part of the problem, but part of it is just being able to think long term. Policymakers get rewarded for short-term actions. Government of any country has to be seen to respond to a disaster, but to take actions that will benefit 10 or 15 years in the future, when those politicians are probably out of office and won't receive a political payoff, is more problematic. I mean, I think that's universal, whether it's France or Pakistan.
Absolutely interesting, because at least when it comes to IDPs, what happens usually, research, you mentioned the UNUEHS, you mentioned one university. Right. What happens, what we see in these, what we see in their research reports is the fact that migration decisions are really interconnected with livelihood strategies. So you find overlaps between economic migration and climate-induced migration. It's just something I believe everybody's still struggling with, and nobody has the answers to. And but you also happen to mention that it is ultimately a problem of political will. It's a problem of short-term policy making, but the first time that the global policy leaders came together at Cancun to put in climate displacement in the framework, in the adaptation framework, I think the problem was right there. I mean, states refused to, or policymakers refused to move beyond a particular point to commit themselves to protecting climate migrants. So where do you see global policymaking or national or regional policymaking going from here, on the question of political will?
You see some governments that take climate change very seriously and I think are working. I mean, I often think that Vanuatu, a small Pacific island, has the world's best, most comprehensive policy on climate displacement. It talks about all phases. It talks about who in the government is responsible for doing what. I mean, it's really a really good policy. Fiji has developed policies, particularly on planned relocations. How do you move a whole community? And there in particular, Asia has a lot of experience with planned relocations, most of it negative, talking about displacement caused by dam construction, for example. But there are a lot of lessons there that can be learned when governments move people for environmental reasons. I think Vietnam has moved something like 300,000 or 400,000 people for environmental reasons away from coast to protect them from flooding. Some of the research that's been done on that shows that most of those who moved feel safer. I mean, that's the objective of these moves. They feel safer, but they've taken on more debt to pay for the move. So there are economic trade-offs on this. So I think that governments have to really assess the risk in their communities to figure out who is in a position to make good policy. And there, I always believe in a strong role for civil society to make sure that in these considerations, the basic human rights of people are taken into consideration. It isn't just about, scientific factors and always is about rights. Civil society and academics have a role to play in these as well.
Absolutely, Dr. Ferris. And I think, like you mentioned, planned relocations or evacuations of people, government-aided evacuations are often fall into deeper trouble when, you do not have community-based approaches to such relocations. So I think there are, since this is definitely a human rights discussion tonight, and in general as well, I think we find a lot of pockets of trouble here. For example, if you do not aid people at risk or affected by climate change in moving to safer locations, then that is, of course, a human rights issue. If you do not do it correctly, that's a human rights issue. And so, how do you think? These problems can be straddled? I mean, because there are, multiple problems here.
You're right that there's no easy answer. There's no one size fits all. Every community should do X. It really depends. So I really think that governments at all levels just have to struggle with this, at the local level. I've done some work on these planned relocations in various parts of the world, in the Pacific and in Central America. And that they're always hard. Nobody wants to move. Nobody wants to leave their community. Governments tend to underestimate how long it will take, how expensive it will be. Creation of livelihoods seems to be key. If people don't have work and they move, they'll go back. I mean, lots of cases where relocation was intended to move people to a safer community. But if you can't make a living, you can't find a job, your livelihood, you'll go back. And so you really need to think about all of this and to engage the community, as you said.
So do you think? Do you think that this is ultimately a problem of recognition? I mean, do you think this is a problem? For example, I think policymakers who compartmentalize people into migrants and refugees and IDPs. So do you think this is actually a problem of compartmentalization? And instead, if governments would recognize vulnerability, instead of creating categories or trying to arrive at legal definitions, do you think that would be more useful in solving the problems you mentioned?
I think you're right that the silos and the compartments are an important part of this. Sometimes these issues fall under the Minister of the Environment. Sometimes it's under a National Disaster Management Agency. It's different agencies that are involved and different assessments, different information. But ultimately, I think that it comes down to a political will. If it's important to people, and people organize, and civil society protests, or there's a sense that, oh, this is an important issue to people, then I think politicians tend to take it more seriously and to make things happen. I think, too, that there are a lot of good things happening at the local level that don't receive much attention. Communities that are already looking at how the community assesses the risk and what the community thinks are ways of dealing with. There are lots of good examples of community-driven initiatives to work with climate change on the local level.
Absolutely. We do have a number of questions flowing into the chat box. So if you would like to take any of them, Dr. Ferris, I would request you to do so.
Great, thanks. And thanks for the questions. I mean, I think the first one really looking at the issue of human capital flight or brain drain is really important, particularly in this context. As I said, it's likely that people with more education, more resources will use traditional economic migration channels to move in response to the effects of climate change. You see the handwriting on the wall. I remember talking with a pastor from Kiribati who told me, he had tears running down his face as he said, I know there's no future in my country, my island, for my children. I know that. I mean, we all see that, our island is going to become uninhabitable probably within my lifetime. And so we sent our son off to school in Australia, to boarding school, and we hope he'll go to university there, and we hope he'll get a job there and will be allowed to stay. He said, so he was thinking, with anticipation, this is not going to work for my son. But, for him personally, it was very sad to think about your children not growing up in your culture or your homeland. And, but somehow he had the means to send his son to school in Australia. So I think we're going to see a lot of that brain drain. I also think that, brain drain is complicated. It isn't just static. It isn't that people with resources leave a country and never come back. They often do come back, or they send money home, or they, can be responsible for brain gain as well as brain drain. You see that, for example, in countries like the Philippines, where a large percentage of the country's medical workers are trained and paid, their education is paid for in the Philippines, and they migrate overseas to work in developed countries. But they send money home. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they come back and set up training centers or contribute. You see that a lot in India with a lot of the folks who have driven the tech miracles in the United States returning to India and using their human capital to really invest in the technology sector in India. So I think all of those trends are going to be accentuated with climate change driven migration.
And just like a part question to Hasiba's question, which is the flip side of having a brain drain in operation is the fact that there are people who stay behind. There are perhaps people of the same family, perhaps women and older persons with disabilities staying behind. So you also see, I think, very differentiated humanitarian concerns, very different needs, very different kinds of vulnerabilities spread out. So what do you think, I mean, since this is essentially, this ends up in a question of policy or law, do you think that it is possible to create a rights-based, a very differentiated rights-based approach for all of these different vulnerabilities?
I think when you look at brain drain or the tendency of educated professionals to seek opportunities in other countries, it really comes to opportunities back home. Just yesterday, one of my students from Ethiopia was telling me about the situation of medical school graduates, and I know nothing about this, but this is what he told me. He said, well, in my country, there are thousands of people who go through medical school, who completed all the requirements, but the government often doesn't issue them degrees because there are no jobs for them. There are no jobs for these thousands of Ethiopian doctors who end up migrating because they want to work in their profession. As long as there is that big difference in opportunities overseas and at home, you're going to see that kind of migration. You see it a lot in the tech sector, of course, but the medical profession as well. You see it less in other sectors, but I think if you want to stop brain drain, then you have to create opportunities at home to enable people to remain and do meaningful work and so on. There's another question here on the pandemic, which I think is really interesting. I haven't seen any credible research showing the relationship between climate change and COVID-19, but there is a lot of research showing that climate change is having a dramatic impact on health as diseases are changing, the vectors are changing. You're having more tropical diseases in places like Alaska that never was vulnerable to things like malaria, and suddenly because of the warming climate, you're seeing this. But maybe the most dramatic case was in Siberia in 2016, I think, where the melting permafrost was releasing long dead, dormant, buried germs from an earlier era where things like plague and anthrax were infecting people in modern times. So there's clearly a relationship between health and the potential for pandemics as a result of climate change. Health experts are really, really worried about it as, for example, the malaria zone expands with warming temperatures, and some of the traditional insects that used to eat mosquitoes are moving, so it's in the fauna is changing as well. So it's kind of a monumental change that's affecting our globe. And then the question from Tanvir of, should you just have open borders for people displaced by climate change? There, I think you run into, first, the hard political reality that no government in the world is going to go for this. Secondly, it's a question of, do you privilege people displaced by climate change over people displaced by wars, conflict, violence, desperate poverty? Does the world have more of an obligation toward those displaced by climate change than those who simply cannot survive at home? You can talk about global responsibility for climate change in the form of carbon emissions, but you can also talk about global responsibility for poverty in certain parts of the world where established economic systems really make it impossible for people to lead decent lives in their countries of origin. So I think that raises lots of questions. What is the international community's responsibility to those displaced by the effects of climate change or disasters, and how does that compare with poverty, violence, war, persecution? Other questions?
We don't have any more questions, but if you would, Dr. Ferris, like to discuss a little bit on why it's, why there are so many, there's so much of difficulty in drawing up a definition of environmental migration for our audience, and why the lack of a definition would be so important. Why is the lack of a definition so important for, the lack of rights?
Yeah, the terminology question is really difficult for this area. I mean, part of the problem is that, all of this movement is multi-causal. So it isn't just a hurricane that makes people move. It's your risk tolerance, it's your ability, it's your social networks. I mean, if you have somebody who's moved to the city, you're more likely to move there than if you don't. And there are lots of factors so it isn't intellectually honest to say this is a climate change refugee. This is somebody whose sole reason for moving is climate change. You just can't say that, at least not yet. That may change as climate change effects become more dramatic. If sea level rise really does make some of these islands uninhabitable, and it's clear that sea level rises due to global warming was the only cause. But right now, it's really difficult. As I said, the refugee people, strongly object to using the term climate change refugee or environmental refugee because they feel like it weakens the already fragile refugee convention and the use of that term. Once you start using it for economic refugees and climate refugees, then it makes it more difficult to advocate on behalf of those fleeing persecution who need that particular legal protection. The problem is that those terms, climate change refugee, resonates with people, ordinary people. My mom can understand climate change refugee. The intellectually more accurate term, environmental migration and displacement, it doesn't roll off the tongue. It doesn't have the same kind of impact on ordinary people or on political leaders. There's legislation in the U.S. Congress right now, really well intended to allow people fleeing the effects of climate change to enter the United States as refugees. And, the senator, bless his heart, wanted to do the right thing, but the terminology is a mess. Referring to climate change refugees, or, we will how can you tell somebody's been displaced by climate change and that it wasn't a cyclone that would have happened anyway without climate change? It's really hard to do this in a way that's, honest, it's accurate, but it's understood by ordinary people. And right now we've got a dozen different terms floating around. You've got eco-migrants and survival migrants and climate-migrants, and we've got all kinds of words floating around. It makes it really difficult to mobilize and support particular policies. But let me say before we close, I really encourage all of you to look into this. We really need some good research on these issues, whether it's at the household level. How do people decide when too much risk is too much? How do they decide where to go, when to move, or when to stay? So understanding some of those factors, or looking at some of the policies in cities in India. I mean, in some ways, some Indian cities have really done a lot in terms of looking at the impact of climate change and environment on migration. I think there are tons of great research opportunities, either in India or around the world. We need good work on this.
And Dr. Ferris, do you think it's a better idea to move with sub-regional or regional frameworks than trying to draw up something very global like the guiding principles on internal displacement? Do you think a smaller thing works?
I do. I think that working at the regional or sub-regional level makes a lot of sense. Working at the national level on internal displacement makes all the sense in the world, with coming up with some good policies, even if don't cover everything. So I do think that that's the way forward. Right now the whole multilateral system is, I think, really incredible. The Security Council is blocked. UN hasn't been very effective in stopping or preventing or resolving conflicts at all in recent years. So, I think it's very unlikely we'll get a new global treaty or binding convention on climate change, refugees, but we can do a lot on the national and local and regional level. So that's where I think we ought to be putting energy.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. This was a very wonderful discussion. And I would request Radhe to please come online. And
thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Sengupta. I would like to take this opportunity to give my warm regards and thank to Ms. Ferris for taking out time from a busy schedule and discussing her thoughts and expertise on the subject. I would also like to thank Ms. Sengupta for conducting this session so wonderfully. It was an absolute pleasure to listen to both of you. And I would also lastly like to thank the audience who have been so engaging and interacting. Thanks to everyone present here. It was a wonderful experience. Thank you.
thank you.
And thanks to all of you. I really enjoyed it. And feel free to contact me if you have other questions or want to follow up on anything. And good luck, Rosina House, with your conversations to come.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferris. It was wonderful having you.
Great. I will see you soon. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.